So this is a video response to a side piece article in the latest issue of Boxing News. The writer gives a ranking of Jack Dempsey's top 10 most famous fights. I'm doing something a little bit differently here in that I want to count down his most significant fights in his career. The New York Sun wrote of Willie Meehan, quote, "He is so fat that blows make no impression upon him, and he is so awkward that even the cleverest of opponents cannot figure out a way to reach him effectively. Despite the ludicrous appearance he makes in the ring, Meehan really knows a great deal about the game of fisticuffs, and he is far from being the easy mark he looks." Now every fighter has someone that simply causes him trouble every time out. For Jack Dempsey, that fighter was San Francisco's Willie Fat Boy Meehan. Now Dempsey would fight Meehan 5 times over the course of a year, and in their final fight in 1918, Meehan would defeat the fast-rising Dempsey. Now Meehan was an oddity in that he didn't bother training, sparring, doing road work, or dieting. He got by on his own innate ring smarts, despite weighing as high as 200 pounds at a height of 5'9". And despite his physical disadvantages, Meehan had Dempsey's number. Willie Meehan said, quote, "The Dempsey I beat in our last fight was a far different fighter than the man I met the first time. He had become ring smart, but there was one thing about him which was the same: his bone-crushing punches." He came to Frisco in 1918, fresh from a long string of quick knockouts. Everybody said, "Here's where Willie gets his." I made up my mind before the fight. If he knocked me out, I'd quit the ring. But he didn't put me away. I will never forget one punch he gave me, though, as long as I live. It jarred me so much I wasn't right for 2 months afterward. Someday I'll tell the world what the blow was. It was like dynamite. I think that when Dempsey measured me, landed his knockout wallop, and saw that I didn't drop as his other opponents had, it took the heart out of him, and he let me win on points. Now, Billy Miske was one of the more underrated and toughest fighters of his time period, as he fought opponents with a debilitating illness. One of his opponents was, of course, Jack Dempsey, which he would meet 3 times. Their first fight was relatively competitive, with Dempsey outworking Miske, but the second bout was a dull affair, with Miske hanging on too much in order to survive. Here in their third fight for the title, it is significant for being the first fight which would be broadcast on radio. Dempsey would take out Miske in the 3rd round, which was reportedly the first time that Miske would ever hit the deck. But it must be said that Miske was suffering from Bright's disease. It's an affliction that inflamed his kidneys. Dempsey said, quote, "During the fight, I began to feel that Billy wasn't giving me as tough a battle as I expected. He did not seem like his old self." Now, Dempsey was a bit past his prime and the underdog when he took on future heavyweight champion Jack Sharkey. Dempsey was 7 years older and had much more miles on his odometer than the up-and-coming Sharkey. The bout didn't start well for the Manasseh Mauler, as Sharkey took the fight to the older man, stunning Dempsey numerous times, remarking Dempsey to admit afterward, quote, "I thought he was going to knock me out." Now, sports writer Roger Kahn wrote, quote, "Unlike Tunney, Sharkey carried the fight to Dempsey. He had a snapping left hand, and he moved far ahead through the first 5 rounds. Only Dempsey's great staying power saved him. His then manager, Leo Flynn, shouted to Dempsey between rounds, 'Go to the body. He doesn't like it in the guts.' Sharkey had a special tactic to protect his middle. He wore the belt of his boxing shorts high." Now, Dempsey was behind on points, but he gritted his teeth and dug deep. He began digging body shots and a few well-placed low blows in the 7th round, which prompted Sharkey to complain to the referee and make the fatal mistake of taking his eyes off Dempsey. "I hit him with one of the last good punches of my life," Dempsey said afterward. "It was everything I could throw. His chin was sticking out there, unprotected. I couldn't miss." Dempsey had a fierce battle in a rematch with Bill Brennan in 1920, pulling out a victory from the jaws of defeat, and the fact that this encounter is an afterthought to many when discussing the when discussing the victories of Dempsey's career is a head-scratcher. Their first fight was a title eliminator for a crack at Jess Willard. Dempsey did have a lot of respect for Brennan, and the two were friends outside the ring. Inside, however, they both understood that it was all business. Dempsey would knock out Brennan in the 6th round in their first fight, hitting Brennan so hard that his legs locked and he would break his ankle in the fall. But in the rematch, the tough Brennan was determined to become heavyweight champion. He hurt Dempsey in the 2nd round, clipping the champion with a right, which caused Dempsey to reel around the ring like a drunk. Dempsey would later say that, quote, had Brennan followed up, he'd have been heavyweight champion of the world. I was completely helpless. Brennan would dominate the fight until the 9th round, where Dempsey began to mount a comeback. In the 12th round, Dempsey finally caught up to his foe, putting him on the canvas with his vaunted left hook. He needed a knockout to win, and he got it. I felt like I was going to heaven, Dempsey said when he watched Brennan get counted out. Brennan was alleged to have a backer in mobster Al Capone. Tragically, he would be murdered by gangsters after a bootlegging dispute and leave behind a wife and a 3-year-old daughter. Now, Fred Fulton was a big heavyweight for the day at 6'6", and he was favored to upset then champion Jess Willard if they were ever to meet in the ring, as it was reported that he had floored Willard in an exhibition match. He was a plasterer by trade and was considered a murderous puncher at the time with 73 knockouts and 82 wins. But he was a hothead, getting in trouble with the law for assaulting his own brother and for throwing a woman into a pond during an argument. Dempsey would be the underdog going into this fight with Fred Fulton in 1918, as he was still an unknown, but the bout would mark his entry into the heavyweight sweepstakes, as he would stun Fulton and stop him in the 1st round. The Washington Post reported, quote, it took Jack Dempsey, until a few months ago an unheard-of boxer, only 23 seconds this evening to take his place at the top of the pugilistic ladder as the man most likely to gain the heavyweight championship of the world. He achieved this by knocking out Fred Fulton in the 1st round of their scheduled 8-round battle here with a right to the jaw. Fulton, looked on as the most formidable rival of Jess Willard, was relegated to the pugilistic scrap heap by 1 punch. Now, Dempsey had sparred with Tunney before and had easily had his way with him years earlier, so he wasn't expecting a tough fight from the former Marine. But when they met in 1926, Dempsey himself was the first to be impressed with Tunney's improvement in both his technique and his physique. The fight would take place before a crowd of over 120,000 people. It was the largest paid attendance ever for a boxing match until Julio Cesar Chavez and Greg Haugen would break the record almost 70 years later. Tunney would win every round, and some have blamed Dempsey's listless performance on food poisoning. On the day of the fight, one of Dempsey's bodyguards gave him a small glass of olive oil. This was a pre-fight ritual for Dempsey to help him digest his food, but Dempsey fell ill after drinking the olive oil, and rumors began spreading that gamblers had instructed Dempsey's bodyguard to put poison in Dempsey's drink. Nothing was ever proven, but many now believe that crime boss Arnold Rothstein helped put the fix in, as he had bet over $125,000 at 4-to-1 odds that Tunney would win. Before there was Hagler Hearns and Foreman Lyle, there was Dempsey versus Firpo in September of 1923. Firpo was nicknamed the Wild Bull of the Pampas, and writer Thomas Wolfe referenced him in a 1939 novel, The Web in the Rock. He said, quote, Firpo had been well named. He was really like a sullen human bull. Dempsey could not be still. As he got his last instructions, he fidgeted nervously and kept his head down, a little to one side, not meeting Firpo's sullen and stolid look. The bout, which lasted a total of 4 minutes, is arguably the fiercest fight in heavyweight history. Firpo started fast, flooring Dempsey at the start of round 1, but Dempsey roared back, bouncing Firpo off the canvas like a canceled check. During this time, the neutral corner rule was in place, but it was not enforced by the referee, as he allowed Dempsey to stand directly over Firpo after each knockdown. Firpo managed to recover and knock down Dempsey, He would knock Dempsey through the ropes, and his fall was broken by a reporter, but he hit the back of his head on the typewriter and suffered a gash on the back of his head. It would take Dempsey 14 seconds to enter back in the ring with the aid of reporters pushing him back in. And Dempsey would finish Firpo in dramatic fashion, and the fight itself would take on mythic proportions. A famous painting would be made of the bout, and the battle would be referenced in numerous books and movies, and Firpo himself would become a legend in his native Argentina. He would become a wealthy rancher after the fight, and a soccer team would be named after him. Dempsey himself lauded Firpo as one of his toughest opponents. He said, quote, "He is game and the hardest puncher I have ever faced. It was the first time I was knocked down since I became champion, and I'll never forget it. I saw 8 million stars when I got that punch on the chin that knocked me out of the ring. I didn't even know he had knocked me out of the ring until I came on my stool between rounds. I thought I'd been knocked out." Now, Dempsey would take on one of boxing's most popular champions of the time period in light heavyweight George Carpentier. The bout would be promoted as the fight of the century, and it would produce the first ever $1 million gate, grossing over $1.7 million in 1921 money. This was also one of the first times that a narrative of a good versus bad was used by a boxing promoter, as Dempsey, ironically, was cast as the bad guy in this bout, as he did not serve in World War I. There were those who saw him as a draft dodger, and promoter Tex Rickard took advantage of this narrative, even though Dempsey did nothing to dodge the draft. Rickard saw dollar signs in casting Dempsey as the bad guy versus Carpentier, who had served in World War I as a fighter pilot, getting 2 of the highest French military honors for his heroism in the war. So he was seen as the hero here by his countrymen and American fans alike. But public sentiments aside, Dempsey had close to a 20-pound weight advantage. He was still shook by Carpentier in the second round, but from there, Dempsey would savage his smaller foe, completing the job in less than 4 rounds. Carpentier would remain in a positive light, however, returning to his native France, and he would enjoy a career as an actor. Dempsey himself would be re-embraced as a hero after the fight, after he helped Carpentier back to his feet after knocking him out, and he was gracious to him in his victory. Now, the rematch between Dempsey and Tunney was a carbon copy replay of their first fight until the 7th round, and that is when literally all hell breaks loose. Dempsey is hopelessly behind until he finally tags Tunney. He either forgets or doesn't know about the neutral corner rule, as he fails to go to the opposite corner, and Tunney is actually on the canvas for 14 seconds. The controversy would haunt referee Dave Barry for years, as whenever a fighter was knocked down in a bout he was officiating, the fans would taunt him with the count of 14. Tunney does look like he has his bearings though, and in later interviews he states that he had his faculties together by the count of 2. He would arise and floor Dempsey in the next round, and strangely the referee Dave Barry would begin counting before Tunney himself reaches the neutral corner. So Tunney would win the decision, but the fight remains one of the more controversial in boxing history, as Dempsey's fans would lament the fact that he should have been the victor by knockout. Nonetheless, Dempsey was past his prime here, and Tunney clearly had his number. Sports writer Shirley Povich wrote, quote, "The Jack Dempsey who was in the ring with Tunney tonight was old. He was soft. He was deep down on the downgrade of his pugilistic career, still with the willingness to force the battle but without the ability. Gene Tunney met almost the same man whom he defeated in Philadelphia." Now, Jack Dempsey's 3-round slaughter of champion Jess Willard is the stuff of legends, and unlikely given the circumstances of his life only years prior. Dempsey was a hobo, riding the trains throughout the United States, seeking any kind of work imaginable, from farming to boxing to whatever. He said, quote, "I was a dishwasher and a miner. I dug ditches, punched cattle, shined shoes. I went hungry for days rather than steal. I begged for any kind of job to earn a flop and a meal." Now, Jess Willard, on the other hand, was one of the most famous men in America after defeating Jack Johnson in 1915. He would remain inactive for over 4 years, taking only one fight in the interim. And instead of defending his title, he would tour the country with Wild West shows, and he would earn almost $6,000 a week. And by the time he faced Dempsey, he was over 37 years old and weighed 245 out-of-shape pounds. Now, Dempsey, on the other hand, was 24 years old and he weighed a svelte 187. Now, there was a minor controversy as the first round ended with Willard down in the neutral corner, with the referee proceeding to count him out, but the crowd was so loud that he did not hear the whistle ending the round. Dempsey was declared the winner, was on his way back to the dressing room before he was called back, and the beating continued. The bout would showcase Dempsey at his savage best. He shows no mercy in destroying the much larger Jess Willard. He would break his jaw, break his nose, knock out 6 of his teeth, and bust his eardrum. There would be more controversy later on as Jack Kearns, Jack Dempsey's then manager, would publish an article in Sports Illustrated that stating that Dempsey's gloves were loaded with plaster. Willard would attest to this fact, but Dempsey would later sue Sports Illustrated for printing the article, and a settlement was reached in his favor out of court. The fact remains, though, that this knockout started a new era in the sport. Promoter Tex Rickard saw Jack Dempsey as the hard-charging, wild-springing brawler who would put fans in the seats and become a star. But he became even more than that. He became a sports icon of the 1920s and beyond.